The wind howled across the bleak encampment, carrying with it the sharp tang of pine and the more ominous scent of burning pitch. Tents rippled beneath the onslaught, rattling as if alive with fear. Snow flurried in small cyclones between the lines of men, stirring cloaks and snapping at fur-lined hoods. The weather had grown savage over the last few weeks, an unrelenting enemy almost as daunting as the foes lurking to the north. Winter had not yet arrived in full force, but the world seemed on the brink of collapse under its weight. Darkness stretched over the horizon, unbroken except by the faint glow of fires from those determined to keep watch throughout the night. Within the largest tent, King Stannis Baratheon stood like a statue. Every muscle in his body was tense, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that a dull ache radiated through his temples. His eyes, a color that flickered between ice blue and storm gray depending on the dying light, were fixed on a single point, the iron brazier that glowed dully, offering neither warmth nor comfort. Firelight revealed the lines of exhaustion on his stern face and illuminated the rigid set of his shoulders. His presence inspired a mixture of fear and respect in those who followed him, but, in that moment, he felt the cold presence of despair creeping in around the edges of his heart. To one side of him stood Davos Seaworth, his broad face etched with concern. The Onion Knight's eyes shifted from Stannis to the figure by the tent flap. The flickering torches made Davos's expression impossible to read for an instant, though worry radiated from every line in his posture. He knew that words meant little right now. Any protest might push Stannis further toward bitterness. But Davos's loyalty warred with his conscience. He had followed Stannis through battle and famine, but what now stirred in the king's mind went beyond the bounds of ordinary cruelty. In the corner, silent as a ghost, was Queen Celis. Her thin frame was draped in heavy furs, and there was a keen mania burning in her gaze. Her fingers clutched at the trim of her cloak, twisting it in jerky motions. She had eagerly embraced the Red God, following Melisandre's teachings with a fervor that sometimes surpassed that of the priestess herself. Yet there was something in Celis' eyes that flickered with uncertainty now, as though the frigid wind outside had found a crack in her rigid convictions. Between them all stood Princess Shireen, 13 years old, with a face still touched by childhood softness and marred on one cheek by the grayscale that had nearly claimed her life as an infant. She watched her parents with an anxious glance, not fully understanding why the tension in the tent had grown so thick, or why her father's gaze, usually stern but loving, seemed haunted by some dreadful possibility. The princess's hands fidgeted as she clung to the worn edges of a book she carried, her lips pressed tightly together. And then there was Melisandre, the Red Woman. Her red robes shimmered in the firelight, and her red hair glowed like an ember. She wore an expression of unwavering confidence, her scarlet lips turned upward in the faintest of smiles. She had guided Stannis through the darkness and had promised him victory. She had shown him visions in the flames, visions that had led them all here, to the brink of an unthinkable act. For nights on end, Stannis had wrestled with the Red Priestess's whispering counsel. She insisted that the Lord of Light demanded a sacrifice, royal blood to appease the flames and melt the unyielding snows of the northern wastes. She insisted that only an act of supreme faith would grant Stannis the victory he so desperately sought, the defeat of the Boltons and the safeguarding of the realm from worse terrors lurking beyond the wall. And each time, the flicker in her eyes suggested that she would not flinch at the sacrifice of Shireen, his only child, his heir. But something had changed in Stannis. Perhaps it was the way Shireen looked up at him, trusting him completely, convinced of his love despite his oft-remote demeanor. Perhaps it was Davos's quiet pleas, too subtle to be called open defiance, but heartfelt enough to stir a faint echo of doubt. Perhaps it was the ghosts of his own regrets, accumulated from years of bitterness and overshadowed by his relentless pursuit of justice. In the madness of that night, in the swirl of wind and snow, he made his decision. Stannis lifted his gaze from the brazier and fixed his eyes on Melisandre. She stood so confidently, so certain that her advice would be followed. The muscles in Stannis's jaw twitched, and his voice emerged like distant thunder. "You have told me many times of my destiny, priestess. You have shown me the path the Lord of Light demands I tread. You say there must be sacrifice, a life given to the flames to secure our cause. Melisandre bowed her head slightly, her eyes closing in an expression of serene devotion. The hour grows dark, Your Grace. A sacrifice of royal blood is the key. The Lord of Light. Stannis raised a hand, and silence fell. The howling wind outside seemed to grow fiercer, as though an echo of the swirling conflict within him. He took 2 long strides toward Melisandre, his shadow looming against the canvas of the tent. You have always spoken of the weight upon me, he said, voice quieter now, and the purity of the fire that must be lit. You have guided me, but you have also twisted me. You have pulled me toward something I cannot do, something I will not do. Her red eyes opened, widening as if in confusion. Davos felt his heart thump hard in his chest. He sensed that something momentous was about to occur. Shireen looked at her father in bewilderment, while Queen Celis' jaw slackened, the fervor in her gaze flickering like a candle in a sudden breeze. Stannis took another step, until the heat from the brazier licked at his legs and the thick fur trimming his cloak. He turned to Davos, one brow furrowed. "Fetch my guard," he commanded, his tone final. "Have them stand ready outside, and speak no word of this to anyone but the soldiers you trust. Now." Davos bowed, though there was uncertainty in his eyes. He left without a word, the tent flap snapping shut behind him. Celis let out a ragged, disbelieving whisper, though no words formed. Shireen, sensing tensions she could not fully understand, tried to approach her father, but Stannis gestured for her to remain behind him. Melisandre watched, her gaze sharpening as she realized something unexpected was unfolding. She began to speak of visions, of a future blaze in the sky, of a cleansing that would ensure Stannis' triumph. Her voice carried that hypnotic quality, the same mesmerizing lilt that had once captivated him. But now Stannis heard only the keening wind. "I will not kill my child," he said quietly. "That line I will not cross. I see now that I gave you too much power over my choices, in the hope that you would show me the sure path to victory." She tried to respond, tried to guide him back with that same unshakable faith. But the look in his eyes was lethal. She had not foreseen his doubt. She had not accounted for the fatherly love that lurked beneath his stern exterior. The guard arrived, 10 men, grim-faced, loyal to the king. They formed a half-circle around Melisandre. Queen Celis hissed in panic, stepping back as if afraid. Shireen stood near her mother, tears threatening to spill from her eyes, though she did not yet comprehend what was happening. Stannis indicated Melisandre with a curt nod. "Take her," he said. "She has offered her own devotion to the Lord of Light time and time again. If the flames demand a sacrifice, let them have the one who called them forth." Shock rippled through the tent. Even the guards, tough, disciplined soldiers who had waged war in the name of Stannis Baratheon, hesitated for a moment. To lay hands on the Red Woman was an act none would have contemplated mere moments before. She was rumored to wield sorcery and see truths in the flames. She had survived poison. She had birthed living shadows. But the king's order was absolute. Queen Celis found her voice, shrilly protesting, calling this an abomination and a betrayal of everything they believed. Shireen let out a frightened gasp, clutching her book tighter, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. Davos returned to the tent, breath hitching as he realized what Stannis had ordered. Yet he did not intervene. He could see a fiery determination in Stannis' eyes, and somewhere within Davos' soul, relief warred with horror. Relief that Shireen was safe, horror at the grim inevitability of what was about to occur. Melisandre did not struggle. Her hands were seized by 2 of the soldiers, and she kept her chin aloft, eyes glowing with something beyond simple fear. "You do not know what you are doing," she murmured. "The Lord of Light will not be mocked." But Stannis did not pause. "Your life belongs to him, does it not?" he asked. "If your faith is true, the flames will show us their will." They dragged her outside. Snow whipped in the darkness, carried by lashing winds. Men huddled closer to the fires. The entire encampment felt the tremor in the air, the sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Curious eyes turned toward their king's pavilion, toward the torches that now lit a path through the center of the camp. A hastily constructed pyre had stood in readiness for days, prepared by Melisandre's own instructions. She had intended it for the princess, royal blood, untainted. The mere existence of that pyre had turned the stomachs of many men who could guess at its purpose. Now, they saw the Red Priestess dragged toward it by the king's guard. Whispers and exclamations rippled through the crowd. Soldiers who had worshipped Melisandre as a conduit of the Lord of Light looked on in confusion, uncertain whether to intervene. At Stannis' command, the pyre was lit. Dry wood, soaked in oils, caught flame instantly. The raging fire leapt up in a violent dance, painting the night with flickering orange and gold. Sparks flew skyward, lost to the blackness overhead. The men holding Melisandre forced her onto the platform, though she never lost that eerie poise. She watched Stannis with an unwavering gaze, her red hair blowing across her face, lit by the flames that licked at the edges of the woodpile. "Only by the Lord's grace can you be saved," she said, voice echoing across the hush. "This is folly, Stannis Baratheon. I have seen your victory. I have seen the false kings burn, the long night driven back." Her words cut off as the heat of the flames drew closer. The guards did not speak. Their grip was iron, though they were sweating despite the biting cold. Celis screeched, wringing her hands, calling for mercy, for faith, for the Red God's intervention. But no one moved to release Melisandre, not even the half-frozen onlookers who had once believed in her. She had guided them, but now the king's will was clear. "Stand back," Stannis commanded to everyone assembled. His voice held no tremor, but inside, turmoil raged. A small part of him wondered if the Red Woman might have been correct, if by sacrificing her, he was dooming his campaign. But the greater part of him felt a grim satisfaction, the sense that he was reclaiming his own agency. He would not kill his daughter. Even if the snows swallowed his army, even if the Bolton banners flew triumphant in the end, he would keep Shireen from the flames. Davos, standing close by, cast one glance at Stannis. There was a sorrow in the Onion Knight's eyes, but also a quiet acceptance. This was not the path he would have chosen. No sacrifice seemed righteous to him, but it was better, by far, than seeing the princess burn. He remained silent, hands balled into fists, fighting the urge to turn away from the ghastly sight. A roar of flame enveloped the base of the pyre. Melisandre tilted her head back, hair cascading over her shoulders, a halo of red and orange flickering around her. She began to chant, words in an unfamiliar language that thrummed with power. The watchers could not tell if she was summoning the Lord of Light or cursing Stannis and all his men. Some swore they felt a prickle of heat on their faces that was not merely from the pyre but from something deeper, an ancient power pulsing in the dark. As the fire climbed, an anguished cry tore from Melisandre's throat. She had believed in her own invincibility, in the righteousness of her cause. Now, fear and agony blended in her final incantations. Sparks danced in the air, carried high into the night. Those who witnessed it later would speak of how the flames momentarily took a peculiar shape, like wings or a great swirling shadow, before collapsing into a conflagration of timber and flesh. Stannis stood unmoving, watching as the Red Woman was consumed. In the moment she fell silent, a strange gust of wind blew through the camp, snapping tent lines and rattling the branches of nearby trees. The snow hissed against the flames, but the pyre continued to burn. Men looked around in a mixture of awe and fear, half convinced that some vile sorcery might be unleashed upon them in that instant. Then it was over, and the Red Woman was no more. The flames persisted, but the shape of the figure at the center was lost to a swirl of cinders and smoke. Celis collapsed to her knees in the snow, sobbing and incoherent. Shireen stood apart, tears frozen on her cheeks, unable to comprehend how the night had so rapidly descended into such horror. Davos bowed his head, unsure if they had banished evil or simply awakened another. Stannis let out a long, ragged breath. He turned to the men. "Return to your posts," he commanded, and his voice held a note of finality. "We march at dawn." He looked up at the heavens, trying to detect any sign, any shimmer in the sky that might affirm he had made the correct choice. But the sky remained dark and impenetrable, and the cold remained merciless. As the crowd dispersed, low murmurs carried across the camp. The men were uncertain, unsettled by the abrupt turn of events. The Red Priestess had told them the bitter cold was the enemy, that the Lord of Light's warmth would guide them to triumph. Now she was gone, and the cold still held them in its iron grip. Within the king's pavilion, Shireen huddled by a brazier, her book lying unheeded on the ground beside her. She cast a fearful glance at her father when he finally re-entered, shaking the snow off his boots. Stannis looked older than he had just hours before, as though he had aged years in the course of one night. He studied his daughter's face, taking in the tear tracks, the fear. He bent down stiffly and touched her shoulder. She flinched, but she did not pull away from him. "You're safe," he said in a voice that was still gruff, though quieter than usual. "I made sure of that." She did not answer, but she nodded, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Then, as if some measure of relief poured through her, Shireen threw her arms around him. Stannis patted her back awkwardly, uncertain how to return affection. He had never been adept at warmth. Yet he sensed, in the space where her small body pressed against his, a spark of something he had feared lost forever. Hope. Even after everything, there was hope. Queen Celis stood off to the side, her face splotchy with tears and anger. She did not approach her husband. She trembled in place, torn between faith in the Red God's teachings, now left headless with Melisandre's death, and a stunned, motherly relief that Shireen remained alive. She murmured to herself, half-crazed, unable to form coherent prayers. The old convictions Melisandre had instilled in her ward with the new reality. She found no solace in the uncertain gloom. Davos entered, his boots leaving small puddles of melting slush on the canvas floor. He saw father and daughter together, a sight that should have warmed any heart, yet the circumstances weighed heavily. The Onion Knight cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he said, "the men are uneasy, and the snow still falls. We have lost a powerful ally, whatever you think of her. Morale will improve once we leave these cursed hills," Stannis said, drawing away from Shireen. "I will not remain here. If the men are cold, they'll march for heat. If they fear the Bolton swords, they'll keep rank to face them. We do not need sorcery. We only need discipline." There was a starkness to his tone, revealing nothing of the inner storm he must have felt. "Discipline and luck," Davos said softly, though he did not press further. He knew the king was raw, that he had just committed an act that would reverberate throughout the realm. Even if no official bard ever sung of it, the men would whisper stories of how King Stannis burned his trusted advisor and priestess upon her own pyre. The night dragged on. Sentinels huddled around watchfires, staring at the black sky. Each gust of wind rattled the tents like dice in a gambler's cup. The snow did not abate. Despite the sacrifice, the weather seemed indifferent, neither intensifying into a crippling blizzard, nor parting to reveal a clear path. Some men took that as a sign that the Red God had abandoned them. Others shrugged and said winter was winter, with or without gods. In the pale hours before dawn, Stannis emerged from his tent. Though his features were lined with sleeplessness, his posture was rigid, his cloak drawn tight. Queen Celis remained inside, refusing to look at him. Shireen slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by the glow of the flames that had swallowed Melisandre. Davos had gathered the soldiers in neat rows, each man carrying arms and provisions for the march. Horses whickered, stamping hooves against the iced ground. The king's standard snapped in the wind, a stag crowned, set against a field of flame, but it seemed more a relic now. In that pre-dawn gloom, Stannis mounted his horse and looked down the line. "We march south," he announced. "We aim for Winterfell. The snows slow us, but we will not tarry here." The The Bolton's hold cannot withstand a determined siege if we approach with care. A few men hollered in ragged approval, though the cheers lacked their old force. Many still grappled with the memory of what had transpired the night before. Even so, they would follow their king. Stannis might be feared, might be cold, but at least he had not burned his daughter. A number of them had dreaded that rumor turned certainty. With the Red Woman gone, they were left with an unease that the king was no longer favored by the flames, but they would see their duty done. And so they rode, leaving behind the scorched remains of the pyre. Smoke still rose in thin plumes, carrying the last traces of Melisandre's presence to whatever realm might claim them. Ravens circled overhead, cawing into the wind. If the men looked back, they saw only a pillar of drifting smoke against the barren snows cape. Gradually, that too faded into the distance. Stannis pressed them onward relentlessly. Each passing hour tested the limits of the men's endurance. Frostbitten fingers cracked and bled. Horses stumbled in snowdrifts. Supply wagons got stuck in the ice-rutted ground. Still, Stannis drove forward, refusing to yield to the elements. When men cursed under their breath, they did it out of earshot. When they spoke quietly around the campfires at night, they shared the same question. Had the king's sacrifice angered the Lord of Light, or pleased him? The old rumors about the Red Woman's power were strong in many minds. Shireen stayed close to Davos and her father. Even if she did not openly discuss her fears, she took some comfort in Davos's kindly presence, or the brief glimpses of protectiveness she sometimes detected in her father. Celis barely spoke. The queen's fervor seemed to have been shattered along with her illusions. She looked at the swirling snow with a vacant stare, as though searching for a sign that would never come. Though Melisandre's specter weighed on them, the army managed to make some headway in those bitter days. The weather was cruel, but not so severe as to stop them completely. Rations were tight, yet discipline held. Small victories. A group of scouts brought down a deer in a frozen copse, providing a short-lived feast. A thaw of sorts arrived one afternoon, and under that fleeting respite, the men made good time through a pass. These were meager blessings, but blessings all the same. Still, there were nights when Stannis dreamed of flames. Not the comforting flicker of a hearth, but the searing, all-consuming blaze that had claimed the Red Woman. In those dreams, he heard her voice chanting. He saw, or thought he saw, a swirl of shadows coalescing into figures he could not identify. When he woke, sweat cold on his brow, he wondered if this was punishment or if, somehow, she still reached out from beyond the fires. He never confessed these dreams to Davos or to anyone else. Stannis bore them alone, as he did all his burdens. If the price for sparing his daughter was to be haunted, it was one he would pay. One dawn, the watch reported that they were closer to Winterfell than expected. The bleak silhouette of the ancient fortress appeared on the horizon like a sullen beast. Black walls rose out of the tundra. Snow-laden farmland surrounded them in every direction. Fires glimmered along the ramparts, revealing the presence of Bolton archers and lookouts. The approach would be perilous. Stannis surveyed the land. The memory of Melisandre's prophecy lingered. She had spoken of storms, of battles in which he would triumph, of a greater war yet to come. Without her, he only had steel, discipline, and the loyalty of these half-starved men. Yet something in him had changed the night she died. A part of him felt free from the shackles of prophecy, from the weight of her unwavering conviction that sacrifice was the only way forward. "We'll set up camp just out of arrow range," he told Davos. "We will see to the readiness of the men, fortify what we can. Wait for a break in the weather before we make any move." Davos inclined his head. "As you command, your grace." A trace of approval hovered in his voice, subtle. No longer was there the gloom that had filled him when he feared for Shireen's life. He seemed more at ease now that the king relied on strategy instead of the smoky visions of a sorceress. Together, they guided the bulk of the army into a defensive position, establishing a line of tents, a perimeter of sharpened stakes, and a ring of fires to ward off the worst of the cold. For a few days, they simply watched Winterfell's walls. Snow flurries came and went, Scouts skirmished in the distance. Ravens soared overhead, no doubt bearing tidings to the Boltons. Inside the camp, the men drew what warmth they could from the knowledge that they still had a fighting chance. The Red Woman's demise, for all the terror and confusion it caused, had also dispelled a deeper fear, the dread that they might have to watch a child burn. Shireen stayed by her father's side, silently standing at the edge of his war councils. She was not privy to the details, but her presence was a statement. She was alive and she was valued. Stannis might never speak the words, but he had taken a stand as a father, and that alone gave her some small measure of confidence. She grieved for the horror that had passed, though a childish relief lingered that Melisandre, who had often unnerved her, was gone. There was guilt, too. Guilt for feeling safer without the Red Woman. Yet she could not banish the fleeting sense of relief that she would not face the pyre. In the nights that followed, rumors ran wild. Some men claimed to have seen a red shadow wandering the outskirts of camp, an apparition formed from smoke and the last sparks of dying embers. Others said the wind carried whispers in an unknown language, ghostly remnants of Melisandre's final spell. But perhaps these were just soldiers' fancies, born of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Even so, a sense of uneasy calm settled over the king's forces. Now they stood at the threshold of battle, with no illusions of divine intervention. At times, Stannis gazed into the flames of a campfire, recalling how the Red Woman had once shown him shapes and portents there. Now he saw only flickering embers and the dancing silhouette of logs. Perhaps there was no destiny but what men forged themselves. Had the sacrifice wrought any blessing? The weather remained foul, yet not impassably so. The Bolton banners still flew, but there were fissures among their allies. Rumors reached the camp that a group of northern lords, uneasy with the Bolton savagery, might prove sympathetic to Stannis's claim. None of these tidings came from the flames. Rather, they were gleaned by cunning scouts and Davos's carefully dispatched envoys. Perhaps that was how it should be, a king succeeding by virtue of leadership and grit, not by dark miracles. On the eve before the first major assault, Stannis stood on a rise, watching the black shape of Winterfell. The night sky was overcast, thick clouds hiding any hint of moon or stars. Snow fell silently, covering tracks, softening the edges of the world. The hush felt almost reverent. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Shireen, draped in a heavy cloak, her hair stirred by the wind. She looked at him with solemn eyes. Neither spoke for a moment, and in that silence, the bond between them was stronger than it had ever been. Finally, Shireen asked, in a quiet voice, "Father, do you think the snow will ever stop?" He exhaled, his breath fogging in the icy air. "It will," he said, though he was not entirely sure. "All things end eventually, even winter." She nodded as if content with that answer. The swirling flakes caught in her hair, and for a heartbeat, she looked almost ethereal. He put a hand on her shoulder, a clumsy gesture of reassurance. In that brief moment, the rest of the world seemed to recede, leaving only father and daughter on a snowy hill, uncertain of what the next day would bring, but bound together by love and the memory of what had been spared. Below them, the soldiers kept their fires burning, their swords sharpened. They waited for dawn, for the command to move on Winterfell, for the chance to prove their king's choice had not doomed them all. In the hush of the night, as the wind bore away the last vestiges of smoke from the pyre, King Stannis Baratheon stood beside his living daughter. Whether he would triumph or fall, he had taken a stand against the Red Woman's darkest design. For that, at least, he felt the faint stirrings of a conscience at peace. And beyond the drifting snow, the embers of Melisandre's power faded, leaving only mortal men and their mortal choices. The promise of tomorrow, for better or worse, belonged to them.